All right. Today we are looking at comparing and contrasting the theories of justice. I've specifically chosen J.S. Mill, Young, and um, Young and Sandel as my focus point for this lecture and project. Um, give me a second. So my thesis for this is I'm going to be focusing on their take on universal health care and their takes on traditional gender identities. The reason why I chose these two is because of the fact that they all come from separate times in their lives, and they all have very different experiences. And these two, in particular, showcase their takes on these experiences and how stagnant they remain throughout history. So, my belief and my interpretation of their works are Mill's focus on individual liberty, uh, Young's lead on structural oppression, and Sandel's communitarian view of the common good lead to a similar conclusion regarding their potential approaches to the arguments on opposing the government's favor of traditional gender identities and traditionals and support for universal health care, despite the contrasting ideas about justice and neutrality, as they all have different approaches for neutrality and different ways that it should be applied. For example, Young looks at neutrality as a horrible, horrible thing, and government should involve itself into these institutions for the purpose of assisting them for the greater good. However, Mill is like neutrality is actually amazing. He's a great guy, and he's looking at it as a point as to say you shouldn't have a moment where government should need to step in because it could overstep their boundaries. And going on to Sandel on gender favoritism, I don't know how to pronounce it, Sandel would argue against gender favoritism, as it would hinder the basis that the government should equally promote and support anybody. Sandel's critique of Mill's neutrality only argues against the existence of neutrality itself. The state cannot be morally neutral, however, it shouldn't impose upon any gender norms and support a open, supportive discussion. Basically saying that I believe Sandel would look at gender favoritism as a horrible thing regarding its infringement on women and or even men in some cases, and Mill's neutrality would only allow it to continue forward. This is a strong critique that Mill says that the government needs to do something, anything really, and Mill is basically allowing the government to sit there and do nothing. And this leaves the people up to going back to our previous lectures on the common on people in a state of nature. This would allow them to just basically stay in that state of nature. And Sandel is looking at government as a need or as a way that we could use this to move to as a bridge to move forward. And if we were to look at a historical situation, we would look at Puritan New England because of the civil disputes back then on various different levels. Specifically, the gender equality issue was a strong moment that was highlighted. We could actually look at this book called The Handmaid's Tale, very solid, and it's actually based around this situation where women were displayed to be spiritually free. However, when it came to their rights, came to their decisions, it failed. The quote that I chose for this was thinking of the moral agent in this way carries consequences for the way that we think about justice more generally. The notion that we are freely choosing independent selves supports the idea that the principles of justice that define our rights should not rest upon any particular moral or religious conception. Instead, they should try to be neutral among competing visions of the good life. Basically, saying that we should have this idea of other perspectives. We should be open to them, in fact. However, we should be also freely choosing of our independent selves, compassion, enjoyment in life, and freedom. Young, however, is a little bit on the stronger side when it comes to this. Young is in agreement that the government will never truly be free morally. However, she takes it a step further, arguing that the government oversteps into the realm of structural oppression. This is a very strong case or basis for Young's argument throughout this. For this reason, she finds traditional gender identities to reinforce a systemic exclusion and cultural domination, each highlighted throughout her contrastment of the liability model, which is highlighted in the quote here on the right side. Take your time to read, you know. Take your notes as well throughout this. Historically, however, we can apply this to the moon landing era. This is something that I really concocted on my without much research because it strongly looks at how gender identities were influenced during moments where both parties were involved, and actually, women had quite the extensive contribution. This inclusion of the moon landing or argument for the moon landing allows me to say the fact that Young is looking at this more so looks at government as a tool almost to break the ice between both gaps, and in doing so we can involve ourselves for the betterment of each other. As after all, utilitarianism is kind of based around the fact that we should all be happy and this common goal of becoming happy. Young looks at it as a way to say the system is infringing this right. The quote that I chose for this is quite long, so I'll try to paraphrase it all. However, she's basically saying that most of us that look at the production and the structural injustice are are because we follow and accept the rules of the other conventions and the institutions we're in. We enact these conventions and practices in a habitual way. We choose to be inside of these conventions, and we continue to enforce their rules upon each other in a way that some of us wouldn't even understand consciously. And this reflection would, or reflection and deliberation on what we do, uh, is the foreground of our consciousness and the intention of immediate goals that we want to achieve. Basically, saying contribution and community are how we are able to achieve greatness. Mill on gender favoritism, however, looks at it as an infringement on individual liberty. As you can see, they all have the same conclusion. However, the way that they approach this conclusion is very different. Mill looks at it on, and you'll see Mill's simplicity later on in this presentation. And for being for being he's all for government being neutral. All right, he doesn't think that gender favoritism would overstep this boundary, or he believes that gender favoritism would overstep this boundary of neutrality, and it would infringe on the very core of utilitarianism, which he would which it would, you know, go against the greater happiness principle, and it affect them by pretty much 50%, right? It's a woman, oh, sorry, the female populace. Um, and a real life example would actually be Victorian era laws. And their effect on women's freedoms or lack thereof. And these laws influenced their corporeal freedoms and made it so that they weren't able to do anything despite being under a government in which they would assume would protect them equally and their rights equally, which led to unhappiness, which Mill is against. The quote that I chose for this is: "This judgment admits of several exceptions, arising from the other forms in which the notions of good justice and injustice present themselves. For example, the person who suffers of the deprivation may, as a phrase is, have forfeited the rights in which he is so deprived of." This moment, or this deprived of statement, allows me to say that he's looking at this uh, as the government's involvement in denying rights, and the people that involve themselves, in this case women, were denied of deprived actually of their own rights. And going forward on to universal healthcare, very important. um, Sandel critiques the libertarian idea of a government neutrality. He he believes that the arguments that the this would revolve around the government's blah, 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 blah. This would revolve around the governments being able to support a retaining a moral obligation to help their citizens. Injuries act as an outsider force that hinders the individual and is common enough to influence a wide margin of people. Privatized healthcare would only encourage people to stay hindered. If this number progressed too greatly, society wouldn't progress. This is the moment, this progression of society is kind of what I want to highlight about Sandel and its difference maker between Sandel and Young, as they both kind of retain around the source of inequality and uh, and government neutrality being a wrong thing, right? And looking at real life example, Medicare and Medicaid is a pretty clear cut way that we could envision how privatizing healthcare would hinder an extremely large number of people. And as you already know, it is. It allows insurance agents to be the difference maker between somebody receiving help and not receiving help, and it allows them to it allows them to make this decision based off of profitability, which would ultimately lead to a bad thing. The quote that I chose for this was this, but this worry raises an important point. Communal encumbrances can be oppressive. Liberal freedom developed as an antidote for political theories that co-sign persons to destinies fixed by caste or class, station or rank, custom or tradition, inherited status, you get the idea. So how is it possible to acknowledge the moral weight of the community giving a scope of freedom? If the volunteer's conception of the person is too spare, if all obligations are product of our will, how can we see ourselves situated yet free? The reason why I chose this kind of quote and question is it's open ended, and it leaves us to question whether or not the government is able to provide for us, and how can we sit in this provision of the government and not have universal health care. This is my connection between the two. They're trying to say, or rather Sandel is trying to say, that we require freedoms and liberties blessed upon us by our uh, government, and it is their responsibility as the government to provide for us in a way that would allow us to move forward as a whole. And this is that progression that I mentioned earlier. Sandel's, all about it. Young, on the other hand, looks at systemic oppression again. Universal healthcare as another way to avoid social injustice. If we were to leave privatized healthcare, it would leave room for systemic bias. It would also resolve the issues of how we can enforce direct help from the wealthy groups, as it would help fund something that would incorporate themselves and more. Basically, it would benefit themselves and every other person. There's almost no reason not to do it, especially since they pay the same amount. Theoretically, poor health and risk of injury directly reflects the level of injustice, as people in poor areas were more susceptible to harm. Imagine this. You're sitting there in a poor neighborhood, driving around, boom, your car gets hit by a pothole, boom, you get hit by a tree falling down because the sidewalk is made of glass or something, and there's just no infrastructure in healthcare or help for the weeds that grow around, the animals that are around, and this infringes upon everybody, right? Especially those in poor neighborhoods, which Young is all about hating. Young does not like that. Uh, and a good example of this is how the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 is how we can incorporate this universal healthcare idea into Young's argument. As prior to 1990, it wasn't a necessity to accommodate for marginalized or injured groups, people in wheelchairs, people with mental disabilities, people with cast on. This allowed people. This allowed for companies to reject well-able people, at least prior to it. Um, and this influenced a lot of people. All right, it's a grand amount of people. Stairs. There was purely stairs, so people in wheelchairs couldn't go up, and it would allow employers to discriminate against people with injury, which Young is against. All about that life. The social connection model, in the quote that I chose, the social connection model of the responsibility says that the individuals bear responsibility for the structural injustice because they contribute by their actions to the process that produce unjust outcomes. This is the case of potholes going down the street. This is taxes not going towards the education for people with health disability or mental disabilities. Um, Special ed cases. Our responsibility derives from our belonging with others as a system of independent processes of cooperation and competition through which we seek benefits to aim and realize projects. This is building that ramp on next to the stairs. This is taking down anti-homelessness structures. We aim to be happy together. Mill, he's a classic guy. He's all about universal health care. He's all about making other people happy. Without universal health care, people wouldn't be as happy. And it does not restrict the individual liberty in which under the greater happiness principle. This simple idea is rooted behind Young and Sandel's claim. Basically, I'm trying to claim that that Mill is kind of like the basis. He's just the guy that's saying like, hey, we could all be happy. We should all be happy. But where they critique him on is his neutrality on how to be happy. And Mill has a good starting line, but needs a process in which Young and Sandel introduce. I believe that the case of the National Health Service in the United Kingdom is a good example of this coming to life. This universe, the first incorporation, or I guess to my knowledge, one of the first incorporations of universal healthcare. The government intervened following World War II after realizing that its citizens were unhealthy and not happy. It was preventable simply by adding universal healthcare. Um, the quote that I chose for this is: Fifthly, it is by universal admission inconsistent with justice to be partial, to show our favor or preference to one person or another, in matters in which favor and preference do not properly apply. Impartially, however, it does not seem to be regarded as duty in itself, but rather as an instrument of some duty. For it is admitted that the favor and preference are not always censorable, and indeed cases in which they are condemned are rather the exception of the rule. Saying what I'm trying, the reason why I quote this is that it is the favor of our preference of one person over another. It is just happiness. It is to be happy with one another that is makes it our preference. And this harm principle that he's slightly getting into right here allows me to say or look at his take on universal healthcare, and it means that you should only government should only act upon people that cause harm. If government causes harm by not adding universal health care, we should be able to act upon the government. To conclude, there are various approaches and critiques of the neutrality of the government, and when it should or shouldn't be neutral. The utilitarian views of Mill provide a solid front basis, building blocks for a goal. The systemic focus of Young helps focus this viewpoint onto a clear cut example of how it's occurred, and Sandel's view for the need for the common good improves overall enjoyment. Here are my works cited. Thank you so much. You guys have a fantastic night. All right.